A storm brewing. Brielle Jackson's Monday mornings at Franklin High School were always predictable. She knew the routine, the buzzing hallways, the echoing sounds of lockers slamming, and the faint chatter that filled the air. Franklin High was in a suburban part of Ohio, a school known for its academic achievements, but not for its diversity. Brielle, a 16-year-old with deep brown skin and thick curls that framed her face, stood out in more ways than one. Being one of the few black students in a predominantly white school, she had learned to navigate her days carefully, avoiding unnecessary attention. But today was different. As Brielle walked into the bustling cafeteria, she felt a sense of foreboding, like storm clouds gathering in the distance. She clutched her lunch tray tightly, scanning the room for her usual spot near the windows. The sunlight poured in, casting a warm glow over the tables. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could eat in peace and watch the world outside. She made her way there, weaving through clusters of students, each group claiming its territory like islands in a vast ocean. Brielle sat down and unpacked her lunch, a homemade dish of chicken curry and rice, its aroma a comforting reminder of home. Her mother had woken up early to make it, as she did every morning, ensuring Brielle had something warm and nourishing to eat. Brielle took a bite and glanced out the window, letting her mind wander to the upcoming school debate competition. She was Franklin High's star debater, known for her eloquence and sharp wit, though it wasn't something she flaunted. Her confidence often drew attention, but not always the kind she wanted. Across the room, a group of students laughed loudly. Brielle's ears caught the familiar sound of Jason Walker's voice. Jason, a junior known for his sharp tongue and penchant for pushing boundaries, had a reputation for making others the punchline of his jokes. Brielle usually avoided him, keeping her head down and minding her own business. But today, his laughter seemed louder, more pointed, cutting through the ambient noise of the cafeteria. "Too dark," Jason said, his voice carrying across the room like a ripple in still water. The words hit Brielle like a slap, freezing her in place. She didn't need to look up to know he was talking about her. The laughter that followed confirmed it. Her stomach tightened, the familiar sting of humiliation bubbling to the surface. Brielle kept her gaze on her lunch, her fork trembling slightly in her hand. She had been here before, enduring snide comments, the whispers, the double takes. She had learned to let it slide, to swallow her hurt and move on. But today felt different. Jason's voice was louder, his words more deliberate, and the laughter more cruel. "Hey, Brielle," Jason called out, his tone mocking. "You ever think about turning the lights on when you look in the mirror?" Laughter erupted again, sharper this time. Brielle's breath quickened as a knot formed in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the cafeteria on her, some curious, others uncomfortable. No one spoke up. No one intervened. The silence of the bystanders was as loud as Jason's taunts. Brielle's fingers tightened around her fork, her mind racing. She could feel the heat rising to her face, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had two choices: let it slide like she always did, or stand up for herself. The latter felt daunting, like stepping into a storm unprepared, but something deep inside her refused to stay silent. She set her fork down and took a slow, steady breath. The cafeteria noise seemed to fade as she pushed her chair back and stood. The sound of her chair scraping against the tile floor drew the attention of even more students. The room grew quieter, the laughter dying down as heads turned toward her. Jason leaned back in his chair, a smug grin plastered on his face. He crossed his arms, as if daring her to respond. "What's wrong, Brielle?" he said. "Cat got your tongue." Brielle met his gaze, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with determination. She took a step forward, her voice steady but firm. "Do you think you're funny, Jason?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the silence. Jason blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "What?" he said, his smirk faltering. "I asked if you think you're funny," Brielle repeated, her voice louder now. The room was completely silent, all eyes on her. Do you think making fun of someone's skin color makes you clever? Or does it just make you a coward? A murmur rippled through the room. Jason shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. "Relax, it's just a joke," he said, trying to laugh it off. But his voice lacked the bravado it held moments ago. "A joke," Brielle said, her voice rising. "A joke is supposed to be funny. But what you said isn't funny, Jason. It's ignorant. It's hurtful. And it says a lot more about you than it does about me." The tension in the cafeteria was palpable, the air crackling with unspoken words. Brielle stepped closer to Jason's table, her gaze unwavering. "You think you can tear me down because of my skin? Because I'm different? Let me tell you something, Jason. My skin is beautiful. It tells a story of strength, of resilience, of a history you'll never understand. And no matter how many insults you throw my way, you will never make me feel ashamed of who I am." The room erupted in applause, breaking the tense silence. It started with a few claps, then grew louder as more students joined in. Brielle's heart pounded as she stood tall, her chest heaving with emotion. She hadn't planned to make a speech, but the words had poured out of her like a dam breaking. Jason sat frozen, his face flushed with embarrassment. His friends avoided his gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, Jason looked small, his confidence crumbling under the weight of Brielle's words. As the applause died down, Brielle turned back to her table. Her hands trembled as she picked up her fork, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. A few students came by to quietly thank her or offer words of support. One girl whispered, "You're amazing, Brielle. You said what we've all been too scared to say." Brielle nodded, offering a faint smile. But her mind was racing. She had stood up to Jason, but the aftermath was uncertain. Would things change? Or would Jason find another way to target her? She didn't know. But for now, she had made her voice heard. And that, she realized, was a victory in itself. Ripples of change. By the time Brielle returned to her classes that afternoon, the story of her confrontation with Jason had spread like wildfire. Whispers followed her down the hallways, fragments of the cafeteria scene retold with embellishments. Some students marveled at her bravery. Others dismissed her stand as unnecessary drama. Brielle, however, kept her head high, her expression calm. She had learned long ago that confidence could be a shield, even when doubts brewed underneath. In history class, Brielle sat at her usual desk near the back of the room. The teacher, Mr. Palmer, droned on about the civil rights movement, his voice blending into the background noise of Brielle's racing thoughts. She could feel the eyes of her classmates darting toward her, the unspoken curiosity hanging in the air. She ignored it, focusing on her notes. But she couldn't block out the tension entirely. When Mr. Palmer mentioned Rosa Parks' defiance and the Montgomery bus boycott, Brielle felt a surge of irony. Standing up to Jason had felt like a small moment of rebellion, but now she wondered if it could lead to something bigger. During group discussions, Brielle noticed a shift. Normally, she was either ignored or politely tolerated, her contributions met with stiff nods or fleeting glances. But today, her peers leaned in, listening intently. When she spoke about the importance of individual actions sparking collective change, even those who rarely participated chimed in, nodding in agreement. After class, Sarah Daniels, one of the quieter girls in school, approached her. Sarah was known for her artistic talent but rarely spoke out in public. "Hey, Brielle," she said, hesitating. "I just wanted to say, what you did in the cafeteria, it was incredible. I wish I had your courage." Brielle smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Thanks, Sarah. But honestly, I was terrified. I just couldn't stay silent anymore." Sarah nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Still, it mattered. You've inspired a lot of people, whether they say it or not." She hesitated, then added, "I've been dealing with some stuff too. Different, but I know what it feels like to feel small. What you did, it gives me hope." The words lingered with Brielle as she walked to her next class. Hope. She hadn't thought of her actions as anything more than standing up for herself, but Sarah's words planted a seed in her mind. Could she do more? Could this be the start of something larger than just her own fight? By the time lunch rolled around the next day, the cafeteria buzzed with a different energy. Jason sat at his usual table, but the dynamic had shifted. His friends seemed quieter, their laughter subdued. Mia, who had been one of his most vocal supporters, avoided eye contact with everyone, fiddling with her phone instead of joining in on the conversation. Brielle walked into the cafeteria, her tray in hand, and felt the weight of the room's attention. Some students nodded at her in silent solidarity, while others whispered behind cupped hands. She made her way to her usual spot by the window, her movements deliberate and steady. She refused to let the stares intimidate her. As she sat down, a group of students approached her table. Among them was Alex Carter, one of the star athletes and a prominent figure in the school. Brielle raised an eyebrow, surprised. Alex rarely mingled outside his circle of friends. "Hey, Brielle," Alex said, his tone respectful but tentative. "Mind if we sit?" Brielle gestured to the empty seats, unsure of what to expect. The group settled in, their trays clattering softly against the table. "I just wanted to say what you did yesterday was, well, it was brave," Alex said, his voice sincere. "I think a lot of us needed to hear it." Brielle tilted her head, studying him. "Why now, Alex? Why didn't you or anyone else say something when it happened?" Alex looked down, his ears turning red. "Honestly, I didn't know what to say. And I was scared to get involved. But that doesn't make it right." He glanced around the table, and the others nodded in agreement. "We're here because we want to do better. Maybe we can start by standing up with you." Brielle's chest tightened. The idea of not being alone in this fight was both comforting and daunting. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "If you're serious about that, it can't just be about this one moment. Standing up means calling out things like this every time, even when it's uncomfortable. Are you ready for that?" The group exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of determination and uncertainty. Alex spoke again. "We are. And if you have any ideas on how to make this school better, we want to help." Brielle felt a spark of hope. "Then let's start by having a conversation. A real one." That afternoon, Brielle approached Principal Monroe's office, her heart pounding. The idea of speaking to an authority figure about the culture of silence and bullying in the school felt daunting, but she knew it was necessary. She knocked on the door, her resolve firm. "Come in," Principal Monroe's voice called. Brielle stepped inside, clutching her notebook. The principal, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and kind eyes, looked up from her desk. "Brielle, what can I do for you?" Brielle took a deep breath. "I want to talk about what happened in the cafeteria yesterday. But more than that, I want to talk about what's been happening for a long time." Principal Monroe gestured for her to sit, her expression curious. "I heard about the incident. I'm glad you stood up for yourself. But what do you mean by what's been happening for a long time?" Brielle leaned forward, her voice steady but passionate. "There's a culture here, a silence that allows bullying and prejudice to thrive. Jason's comments yesterday weren't just about me. They're part of a larger problem. I think it's time we address it, as a school." The principal listened intently, nodding as Brielle spoke. When she finished, Monroe folded her hands on the desk. "You're absolutely right, Brielle. And I commend you for bringing this to my attention. What do you propose?" Brielle hesitated, then opened her notebook. "We need to start with awareness. Maybe a school-wide assembly, where students can share their experiences, and workshops, something interactive that helps everyone understand the impact of their words and actions." Principal Monroe smiled. "Those are excellent ideas. I'll need your help to make them happen. Are you up for that?" Brielle nodded, a sense of purpose settling over her. "Absolutely." Over the next week, the ripple effect of Brielle's stand continued to grow. Teachers began incorporating discussions about respect and inclusivity into their lessons. The student council reached out to Brielle, asking for her input on initiatives to improve the school's culture. And for the first time in years, students from different cliques began mingling, their shared conversations breaking down old barriers. Jason, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a subdued demeanor. He avoided Brielle in the hallways, his gaze fixed on the ground. Mia, too, seemed to be grappling with her role in the incident. One day, she approached Brielle at her locker, her expression hesitant. "Brielle," she said softly, "can we talk?" Brielle closed her locker, crossing her arms. "I'm listening." Mia took a deep breath. I want to apologize. For laughing, for not stopping Jason. I should have known better." Brielle studied her for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. All she saw was guilt and regret. "It's a start," Brielle said finally. "But if you really mean it, show it. Speak up next time." Mia nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. "I will." As the days turned into weeks, the cafeteria incident became more than just a story. It became a turning point. Grail's voice had sparked something in the school, a shift that was slow but undeniable. And while there was still work to be done, she felt a newfound sense of hope. For the first time, she believed that change was possible, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The awakening. The morning sunlight streamed through Brielle's bedroom window, casting golden rays over the motivational posters that adorned her walls. Her favorite, a quote by Maya Angelou, read, "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." She stared at the words for a moment, letting their weight sink in. The events of the past few days had stirred something deep within her, a sense of responsibility she hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for others too. As she prepared for school, Brielle's phone buzzed. She picked it up, expecting a message from one of her few close friends. Instead, it was a flood of notifications from students she barely knew. Some were words of encouragement, others apologies for past behavior, and a few were just simple acknowledgments of her bravery. She felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, validation, and an underlying pressure to live up to the image they were beginning to associate with her. When she arrived at Franklin High, the atmosphere felt different. Conversations in the hallways seemed quieter, more thoughtful. Groups that once ignored her now nodded in silent acknowledgement as she walked past. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling. She had never sought to be the center of attention, but here she was, a catalyst for change. Homeroom revelation. Brielle's first class of the day was homeroom, a time usually filled with idle chatter and announcements. As she entered, she noticed an unusual hush among her classmates. She took her seat near the back, pulling out her notebook. Moments later, their teacher, Mrs. Grayson, walked in holding a clipboard. "Good morning, everyone," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice carrying a warmth that usually went unnoticed. "Before we get into today's announcements, I want to address something important. Many of you have heard about the events in the cafeteria earlier this week. I won't name names, but I think it's a good opportunity for us to talk about how we treat one another." The room was still. Brielle's stomach tightened as she realized where this was going. "I want to open the floor," Mrs. Grayson continued. "Has anyone here ever felt silenced, judged, or disrespected because of who they are? You don't have to share if you're uncomfortable, but I think it's important for us to listen to one another." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, heavy with unspoken truths. Then, to Brielle's surprise, Sarah Daniels raised her hand. Her voice, usually soft and hesitant, was clear and steady as she spoke. I felt judged for being quiet," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on the desk in front of her. "People think I don't care, or that I'm stuck up, because I don't talk much. But the truth is, I've always been afraid that if I said what I was really thinking, no one would listen." Mrs. Grayson nodded, her expression encouraging. "Thank you for sharing, Sarah. Does anyone else want to share?" To Brielle's astonishment, Hands began to go up around the room. One by one, students opened up about their experiences, feeling excluded because of their weight, their clothes, their family's financial struggles, or the color of their skin. Brielle listened intently, her heart aching with empathy. When the room fell silent again, Mrs. Grayson turned to Brielle. "Brielle, would you like to share anything?" No pressure. Brielle hesitated, her palms sweaty. She felt the weight of their eyes on her, the unspoken expectation that she would say something profound. She took a deep breath and stood. "Most of you know what happened in the cafeteria," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "But what you might not know is how many times I've been made to feel like I don't belong, because of my skin, my hair, my voice, everything that makes me who I am." She paused, scanning the room. The vulnerability in their faces gave her the courage to continue. "I've spent years trying to blend in, to shrink myself so I wouldn't be a target. But the thing is, no matter how much I tried to hide, I was still judged. And when Jason said what he did, I realized I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Because if I didn't stand up for myself, who would?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. A few students nodded, their expressions thoughtful. "And it's not just about me," Brielle added, her voice gaining strength. "It's about all of us. Every single person in this room has something that makes them feel different. And that's not a bad thing. What's bad is when we let those differences divide us instead of bringing us together." The room erupted into applause, but this time it wasn't the polite, obligatory kind. It was genuine, heartfelt. Brielle sat down, her cheeks flushing as a wave of relief washed over her. The principal's challenge. Later that day, Brielle was called to Principal Monroe's office. Her pulse quickened as she approached the door, unsure of what to expect. When she entered, she was met with a warm smile. "Brielle, thank you for coming," Principal Monroe said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've been hearing a lot about you these past few days." Brielle sat down, her posture straight. "I hope it's all good." Principal Monroe chuckled. "Mostly. I wanted to tell you how proud I am of you for speaking up. It's not easy to confront injustice, especially in a setting like this." "Thank you," Brielle said, her voice cautious. "But I feel like there's still so much to do." Principal Monroe leaned forward, her expression serious. "That's exactly why I called you here. We've had issues with bullying and exclusion at this school for years, but what happened in the cafeteria has sparked something. I want to use this moment to create real change, and I think you can help." Brielle blinked, taken aback. "Me?" "Yes," Principal Monroe said. "I'd like you to work with the student council to develop a program that addresses these issues head-on. Maybe workshops, peer-led discussions, even an assembly where students can share their stories." Brielle's mind raced. The idea was overwhelming, but also exhilarating. "I'd love to help," she said finally, "but I'll need support." "You'll have it," Principal Monroe assured her. "From me, from the staff, and I hope from your fellow students as well." A movement begins. Over the next few days, Brielle threw herself into the project. She met with the student council, brainstormed ideas, and reached out to teachers who could help facilitate discussions. The cafeteria confrontation had been the spark, but this was the fire. She created flyers, worked on a social media campaign, and even filmed a short video with Sarah Daniels, who had become one of her strongest allies. In the video, Sarah shared her experience of feeling invisible, while Brielle spoke about the power of standing up for oneself and others. The response was overwhelming. Students began sharing their own stories on social media, tagging the hashtag Franklin Voices. The movement gained momentum, uniting students from all backgrounds. Cliques that had once seemed impenetrable began to blur as students found common ground in their shared humanity. Even Jason, who had been avoiding Brielle since the incident, approached her one afternoon. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a quiet vulnerability. "Brielle," he said, his voice low, I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I said, for everything. I was wrong. Brielle studied him, her expression unreadable. Why now? Jason looked down, his shoulders plumping. Because I see now what I didn't before. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it. Brielle nodded slowly. Thank you. But if you're really sorry, prove it. Stand with us, not against us. Jason met her gaze, a flicker of determination in his eyes. I will. As he walked away, Brielle felt a glimmer of hope. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And as Franklin High began to transform, she realized that her voice wasn't just a tool for survival, it was a force for good. Seeds of solidarity. The energy at Franklin High felt electric as Brielle entered the school building that morning. A once monotonous routine had become a series of unexpected surprises. The cafeteria confrontation had ignited something deeper, a willingness among students to face the undercurrents of prejudice and judgment that had long gone unchallenged. While there were still skeptics and holdouts, an undeniable momentum was building, and Brielle was at the center of it. Her mornings now started earlier than usual. She'd spent late nights drafting plans for the new initiative, aptly named the Voices Project. With Principal Monroe's support, Brielle and the Student Council had outlined a series of events designed to amplify student voices and foster understanding. They called it Solidarity Week, and the first event, a storytelling circle, was set to take place that afternoon. The first circle. The gymnasium felt cavernous as Brielle stepped inside, the squeak of her sneakers echoing in the empty space. Volunteers from the Student Council were busy setting up chairs in a wide circle, their chatter interspersed with the sound of folding metal. At the center of the arrangement stood a small podium and a microphone, an acknowledgement that some stories needed more than one voice to be heard. Brielle helped set out flyers as students began trickling in, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Some came in groups, whispering among themselves, while others came alone, their steps hesitant but purposeful. To Brielle's surprise, even teachers joined the gathering, mingling quietly with the students. By the time the clock struck noon, the gym was filled with more people than she had expected. The noise settled into an anticipatory hush as Brielle stepped to the microphone. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she channeled the energy into focus. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "This is the first of many events we're planning as part of the Voices Project. The goal is simple, to listen. Everyone here has a story, and those stories have the power to connect us in ways we might not realize. Today, we're giving those stories a space to be heard." She paused, scanning the crowd. Faces stared back, some encouraging, others skeptical. She took a breath and continued. "I know what it feels like to have your voice dismissed or silenced, but I also know the power of speaking up. This circle isn't about judgment, it's about understanding. So if you feel comfortable, I encourage you to share." Brielle stepped back, giving the room space to breathe. For a moment, no one moved. Then, to her surprise, Sarah Daniels stood, clutching a piece of paper in her trembling hands. She made her way to the microphone, her steps hesitant but determined. "I've always been the quiet one," Sarah began, her voice soft but clear. "And for a long time, I thought that was just who I was. But the truth is, I stayed quiet because I didn't think anyone cared what I had to say." She paused, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper. When Brielle stood up in the cafeteria, it was the first time I realized that silence doesn't have to be the answer. That maybe, just maybe, my voice matters too. The room was silent as Sarah continued, sharing moments of exclusion and self-doubt. When she finished, applause erupted, loud and sustained. Brielle smiled, her chest swelling with pride as Sarah returned to her seat, her cheeks flushed but her eyes shining with newfound confidence. Jason's turn. As the storytelling continued, Brielle noticed Jason sitting near the back of the gym, his posture stiff. He had come alone, his usual entourage conspicuously absent. Brielle wasn't sure what to make of his presence. Was he there to mock the event, or was he genuinely interested? Her question was answered when Jason, to the audible surprise of the room, stood and made his way to the microphone. The murmurs that followed his movements were a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Vreel tensed, unsure of what he would say. Jason adjusted the microphone awkwardly, his usual bravado replaced by an uncharacteristic nervousness. Hey, he began, his voice unsteady. I know most of you probably don't want to hear from me, and I get that. He glanced at Vreel, his expression apologetic. I want to start by saying I'm sorry. To Vreel, and to anyone else I've ever hurt with my words. What I said in the cafeteria, it wasn't just a joke. It was wrong. And I've spent the last few days trying to figure out why I even said it. Jason took a shaky breath, his gaze fixed on the floor. The truth is, I've always been scared of being invisible. I grew up in a house where you had to be loud to get noticed, and somewhere along the way, I started thinking that tearing other people down was the only way to feel big. But it's not. He looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I want to do better, and I'm here because I want to be part of the change. The room was silent for a beat before tentative applause broke out. Vreel watched Jason as he returned to his seat, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for judgment. She didn't know if his words were enough to undo the harm, but they were a start. And for now, that was all she could ask for. Shifting perspectives. The storytelling circle stretched on, with students and teachers alike stepping forward to share their truths. A teacher spoke about her struggles with cultural identity, having grown up as the child of immigrants. A student revealed how bullying over their weight had led to years of self-doubt. Another student admitted to being part of a group that had once mocked others, saying they now realized the impact of their actions. As the stories unfolded, the room began to feel less like a collection of individuals and more like a community. The invisible walls that had divided cliques and social groups started to crumble, replaced by an unspoken sense of solidarity. When the event ended, students lingered in the gym, their conversations spilling into the hallways. Vreel watched from the sidelines, her heart full. She had hoped the event would make an impact, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply it would resonate. A new chapter. That evening, Vreel sat at her desk, sifting through the day's events. Her notebook was filled with notes and ideas for future initiatives, but her thoughts kept returning to Jason's words. She still wasn't sure if she fully trusted his transformation, but she knew that change, no matter how small, had to start somewhere. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Sarah. Thank you for giving me the courage to speak today. I'll never forget it. Vreel smiled, typing back a quick response before closing her notebook. The work was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone at Franklin High. Change, she realized, wasn't a single act. It was a series of choices, each one building on the last. And together, those choices could create something extraordinary, a catalyst for transformation. The days following the storytelling circle were transformative for Franklin High. The atmosphere in the hallways felt lighter, yet charged with the weight of new understanding. Students who had once passed each other without a second glance were now stopping to talk, acknowledging each other in ways that had been rare before. For Vreel, the shift was both heartening and daunting. Her actions had become a catalyst for change, but she was acutely aware that sustaining this momentum would require more than a single event. Her mornings now began with meetings in Principal Monroe's office or brainstorming sessions with the student council. Flyers for upcoming events were plastered on bulletin boards and taped to lockers, each one bearing the slogan, "One voice can ignite change. Together, we are unstoppable." One morning, Vreel arrived at school early, armed with a stack of posters for the next event, Breaking Barriers Day. The idea was simple yet powerful, a series of workshops where students and teachers would tackle topics like implicit bias, privilege, and allyship. Brielle felt a surge of excitement and nerves as she walked into the empty cafeteria to hang the first poster. "Need a hand?" a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Jason standing a few feet away, holding a roll of tape. His presence still carried a flicker of tension, but his posture was less guarded, his expression earnest. Brielle hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Sure," she said. "Take that side." Jason grabbed the poster's corner and helped her tape it to the wall. They worked in silence for a moment before he spoke. "I know you're probably tired of hearing this," he said, his voice low. "But I really am sorry for what I said. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I want to make things right." Brielle glanced at him, searching his face for sincerity. She saw no hint of the smug arrogance he once carried, only a young man grappling with his mistakes. "Making things right doesn't happen overnight," she said, "but showing up is a start." Jason nodded, his expression serious. "I want to help with Breaking Barriers Day. Whatever you need, setting up, organizing, anything." Brielle studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. "Okay, let's see what you've got." Breaking Barriers Day. The day of the workshops arrived, and the school buzzed with anticipation. Class schedules were adjusted to allow students and teachers to attend sessions on topics ranging from microaggressions to the importance of empathy. Each workshop was led by a mix of teachers, student volunteers, and guest speakers from the community. Brielle's first workshop was titled "Words Matter," a session exploring the impact of language on identity and self-worth. She stood at the front of a packed classroom, her palms sweaty, but her resolve firm. "Language has power," she began, her voice steady. "The words we use can uplift someone or tear them down. And the impact of those words doesn't end when a conversation does. It lingers." She paused, scanning the room. Jason sat near the back, taking notes, a sight she never thought she'd see. Beside him was Sarah Daniels, her notebook open, her hand already raised. "Yes, Sarah," Brielle said. Sarah lowered her hand, her voice clear. "Do you think people always realize how much their words can hurt?" Brielle considered the question. "Not always," she said. "Sometimes people speak without thinking, or they repeat things they've heard without understanding the weight of their meaning. But intent doesn't erase impact. That's why we have to hold ourselves, and each other, accountable." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Brielle felt a swell of pride as more hands shot up, students eager to share their thoughts and experiences. The session flew by, and as it ended, several students lingered to thank her. Jason approached her as she packed up her materials. "That was eye-opening," he admitted. "I never really thought about how much damage a joke can do." "It's never too late to start thinking about it," Brielle said. "The fact that you're here means something." Jason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks for giving me the chance." A ripple effect. Breaking Barriers Day was a resounding success. The workshop sparked conversations that spilled into the hallways, the cafeteria, and even the parking lot after school. Students who had once stayed in their cliques were branching out, engaging with peers they'd never spoken to before. Teachers reported a noticeable shift in the classroom dynamics, with students showing greater respect and empathy for one another. Brielle found herself at the center of it all, her voice sought after for guidance and inspiration. But with the newfound attention came an undercurrent of exhaustion. The pressure to always have the answers, to be the voice of reason, was beginning to weigh on her. That evening, as she sat at her desk reviewing notes for the next event, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "You've been amazing, Brielle. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. We've got your back." Brielle smiled, her chest tightening with gratitude. She put her notebook aside and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Sarah was right. She didn't have to carry this burden alone. The movement wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had chosen to stand with her. A moment of reflection. The next morning, Brielle arrived at school to find the hallways lined with messages of encouragement. Sticky notes adorned lockers, each one bearing words like, "You're enough," Your voice matters, and you're not alone. She traced her fingers over one that read, "Change starts with us," her heart swelling. Jason stood nearby, helping a younger student hang a banner that read, "Together, we rise." He caught Brielle's eye and gave her a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the progress they were making. As Brielle walked to her locker, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of hope. Franklin High was changing, not just in its policies or events, but in its heart. And though the journey was far from over, she knew they were moving in the right direction. For the first time, she felt the weight of possibility, the realization that one voice truly could spark a revolution. And as she stepped into her first class of the day, she carried that knowledge with her, ready to continue the work they had started together. The legacy begins. The momentum at Franklin High had become unstoppable. What started as a single moment of courage in the cafeteria had grown into a movement that touched every corner of the school. The Voices Project was no longer just an initiative. It was a culture shift, one that encouraged students to think beyond themselves and their immediate circles. But for Brielle, the journey was far from over. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities to test her resolve. Though she was proud of what they had accomplished, she also knew that real change wasn't about singular victories. It was about persistence, about turning moments into a legacy. The Community Forum. One of the most ambitious events of the Voices Project was the Community Forum, an evening where students, parents, and teachers came together to discuss the changes happening at Franklin High and explore how they could extend those lessons beyond the school walls. Brielle had been preparing for weeks, coordinating with Principal Monroe, student council members, and even local activists who agreed to speak. The night of the forum, the auditorium was packed. Rows of chairs were filled with familiar faces and strangers alike, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Brielle stood backstage, clutching her speech. Her heart pounded, but she drew strength from the thought of what this night could mean. Principal Monroe opened the event with a brief introduction, praising the students for their courage and leadership. Then she invited Brielle to the stage. As Brielle stepped into the spotlight, the applause was thunderous. She paused, letting the sound wash over her before speaking. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady. "When I first stood up to speak in the cafeteria, I wasn't thinking about starting a movement. I was just tired of being silent. But what I've learned since then is that speaking up is only the first step. True change happens when we listen, when we learn, and when we work together." She glanced at the audience, her gaze meeting the eyes of students who had shared their stories, teachers who had supported them, and parents who had come to understand their children in new ways. "This isn't just about Franklin High," she continued. "It's about creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued. That starts with us, right here, right now. So let's keep pushing. Let's keep listening. Let's make this more than a moment. Let's make it a movement." The applause that followed was deafening, a standing ovation that brought tears to Brielle's eyes. But she didn't linger in the spotlight. She knew the real work was happening in the conversation sparked by her words. Jason's redemption. After the forum, Jason approached Brielle, his hands stuffed in his pockets. His face was a mix of nerves and determination. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet. "That was powerful." "Thanks," Brielle said, her tone neutral but not unfriendly. "How are you doing?" Jason hesitated, then sighed. "Better. It's been hard, realizing how much damage I've done. But I'm trying. I wanted to tell you. I signed up to mentor some of the freshmen. I figured it's a way to start giving back, you know." Brielle studied him for a moment. His transformation had been slow, but it was real. She nodded. "That's a good step, Jason. Keep going." He smiled, a small, genuine expression that spoke volumes. "Thanks, Brielle, for everything." The ripple effect. As the school year progressed, the impact of the Voices Project extended beyond Franklin High. Nearby schools began reaching out, asking for advice on starting their own initiatives. Brielle and the student council became unofficial ambassadors, traveling to other schools to share their story and lead workshops. Local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting the students' efforts to create a more inclusive and empathetic community. Brielle found herself on the front page of the town's newspaper, her photo accompanied by the headline, "One Voice, One Movement: How a High School Student Inspired Change." Despite the growing recognition, Brielle remained grounded. For her, the true reward wasn't the accolades, it was the quiet moments of connection, the stories shared in workshops, the friendships forged across divides. It was watching Sarah Daniels blossom into a confident leader, or seeing Jason mentor younger students with patience and care. A quiet victory. One afternoon, as Brielle sat by her usual spot in the cafeteria, a group of freshmen approached her table. One of them, a boy with thick glasses and a nervous smile, held out a notebook. "Hi, Brielle," he said, his voice trembling slightly. We wrote you a letter." Brielle took the notebook, her heart swelling as she flipped through the pages. Each one was filled with handwritten notes from students she barely knew, all expressing gratitude for what she had done. "You showed me it's okay to be myself. Thank you for standing up when I couldn't. You're the reason I finally spoke up." Tears blurred her vision as she closed the notebook. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." Looking ahead. As graduation approached, Brielle found herself reflecting on the journey. Franklin High wasn't perfect. It still had its challenges, and there was still work to be done. But it was a different place than it had been when she first arrived. And she knew that change wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. At the graduation ceremony, Principal Monroe called her to the stage to receive a special recognition award for her leadership. As Brielle accepted the plaque, the crowd erupted into applause, students and teachers alike rising to their feet. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, Brielle felt something even more powerful than pride. Hope. Hope that the work they had started would continue, carried forward by the next generation of students. Hope that her voice had sparked not just change, but a legacy. And as she walked off the stage, her head held high, she knew that this was only the beginning.